this Friday. Okay, would you now look at Philippians chapter 4? Let's look at verse 4. I highlighted verse 4 last week, but I'm going to use it again this week if it's okay with you. Thank you. Verse 4. Let's look at verses 4, 5, 6, and 7. Paul says, "Rejoice in the Lord always. Again I will say, rejoice. Let your gentleness be known to all men, for the Lord is at hand. Be anxious for nothing, but in everything by prayer and supplication with thanksgiving, let your requests be known to God. And the peace of God, which surpasses all understanding, will guard your hearts and your minds through Jesus Christ." I'm sure you're very, very familiar with verses 6 and 7. Be anxious for nothing. So the title of my message tonight is God's Prescription for Anxiety. God's prescription for anxiety. Did you know that anxiety is the most common mental health condition in all the world? I didn't know that until this evening. I would have thought maybe cancer. Anxiety is the most common mental health condition in all the world. Well, cancer is not a mental health, but you understand what I meant by that. Anxiety. They have called anxiety a global burden. In 2021, let me give you an estimate. They said around 359 million people around the world suffered from anxiety. That's a whole lot of people, isn't it? They have reported that anxiety affects in the United States alone approximately 20% of adults. That is over 50 million people on the daily suffering with anxiety. With those facts in mind, now consider that little phrase in verse 6. Paul says, be anxious for what? Nothing. Maybe in today's language he would say, have anxiety over nothing. Rather than being anxious for nothing, it appears as though the world and even Christians are oftentimes anxious for everything. Sometimes I find myself being a worrywart. You ever heard that? Worry. The fact that we are so anxious is remarkable, really, because here's what Paul says, and I love it. Be anxious for nothing. Nothing. Anxiety comes in a lot of forms. Possibly you've been anxious as you await a doctor's phone call. That'll do it. Waiting for him to call. Possibly anxiety has gripped your heart concerning a big decision you would have to make. Lord, what am I going to do? Possibly you've been anxious as you tried to get a family member on the phone and they wouldn't answer after 3 or 4 times calling them. That one will really do it, because your mind immediately goes to the worst. Possibly you're anxious when you hear an ambulance pass by in your own neighborhood. Where's that headed? Is that headed to a friend or a family member? Whatever the case might be, my point is this: we have all experienced anxiety, have we not? Every single one of us. Even Peter, that great apostle, even he experienced anxiety. You remember he was walking on water until he looked around and the winds and the waves were pretty bad. He became anxious. Can we look at that? Go to Matthew chapter 14 really quick. I just want to show you that little story. Matthew 14, verse 25. Now on the 4th watch of the night, Jesus went to them walking on the sea. Let's pause right there. That little statement has always baffled me. Jesus went to them walking on the sea. That's just wild. And when the disciples saw him walking on the sea, they were troubled, saying, "It's a ghost." And they cried out for fear. I mean, can you blame them? But immediately Jesus spoke to them, saying, "Be of good cheer. It is I. Do not be afraid." Peter answered him and said, "Lord, if it is you, command me to come to you on the water." Let's pause right there. In other words, what Peter was saying is, look, it appears as though it's a ghost, but he says, "Don't be afraid, it's I." So Peter, in a way, puts it to the test, that statement. If it's Jesus, I'll walk on the water. If it's not, I'm going to sink like a log, right? Jesus says, come. And when Peter had come down from the boat, he walked on the water to go to Jesus. In other words, it was absolutely the Son of God. But when he saw that the wind was boisterous, he was afraid and began to sink. He cried out, saying, Lord, save me. And immediately Jesus stretched out his hand and called him and said to him, O ye of little faith, why did you doubt? And when they got into the boat, the wind ceased. Then those who were on the boat came and worshipped him, saying, Truly, you are the Son of God. So he experienced instant anxiety. Notice he was all good when his eyes were fixed on Jesus, but when he began to look at the storm, he began to sink like a rock. My point is this: the entirety of the human race has experienced some degree of anxiety. And if that were the end of my message, it'd be pretty depressing. We'd go home experiencing anxiety and depression. Nevertheless, there's a cure. God has a prescription. Did you know that God has a prescription for everything which we suffer from? For sin, God has given us the cross of the Lord Jesus Christ. For death, he gives us a resurrection. For hell, he gives us heaven. And now for anxiety, God will tell us two things to do in order to be cured. Is this a message y'all want to hear? Two things to do to cure anxiety. And they work 100%. This is good news. Number 1, verse 4, he says, rejoice in the Lord always. Again, I will say rejoice. That's number 1. God's prescription is rejoice. In other words, you either worship or you worry. Which one are you doing? You either worship or you worry. Here's a fact. Did you know that God has made the human mind so that it cannot think of two things at the same time? Try it. Impossible. Let me give you a fact. The brain cannot consciously focus on two attention-demanding tasks simultaneously. God has done this. That is why he says, instead of being anxious over such and such and such, the first thing you ought to do is rejoice. If you're rejoicing, you can't be worrying. If you're worshiping, you can't be worrying. Here is the simple yet profound life-changing truth. You ready? You cannot, under any circumstance, worship the Lord and be anxious at the same time. It is impossible. Impossible. You can't worry, and simultaneously worship Jesus. You're either anxious or you're worshiping. Your eyes are either fixed on Jesus or on your circumstances. That's what we just learned from Peter. He was either looking Jesus straight in the face and walking on water, or we're looking at the storm and sinking, about to drown. And that proves that Peter had a one-track mind. We all have a one-track mind, right? God made us this way. As long as Peter looked at Jesus, he stayed afloat, and the storm could not touch him. However, the moment he switched channels of his mind and went to the storm from Jesus, he would sink. So the truth is this: you're either walking on water or sinking like a rock. Your eyes are either on Jesus or on the storm. And so oftentimes our eyes on the storm. Consider also for a moment the children of Israel. You remember the Lord said, look, as long as you trust me, as long as you believe, as long as you worship me, as long as you obey me, I will drive out the peoples before your face so that you can go into the promised land. In other words, it's going to be rather easy. I will instill fear in their hearts so that they will pretty much give the land to you, as long as you trust me. However, do you remember when Joshua and Caleb went to look and spy out the promised land? They came back with reports. Joshua and Caleb were positive. But I think about 10 of the other spies says, no, there are giants in the land. And you remember what fell over the children of Israel? Fear. They said, we can't take them. We're as grasshoppers to them. What this tells me is that they too possessed a one-track mind. They were either focused on the Lord and his promise that he would give them the victory, or on the giants in the land. Go to Numbers 13. I'll show you this as well quickly. Numbers chapter 13, verse 30. Numbers 13, verse 30. It says, Then Caleb quieted the people before Moses and said, Let us go up at once and take the possession, for we are well able to overcome it. But the men who had gone up with him said, We are not able to go up against the people, for they are stronger than we. And they gave the children of Israel a bad report of the land, which they had spied out, saying, The land through which we have gone as spies is a land that devours its inhabitants, and all the people who we saw in it are men of great stature. There we saw the giants, the descendants of Anak, come from the giants, and we were like grasshoppers in our own sight, and so we were in their sight. So they too had a one-track mind. They were worried about the giants. And the truth is this, you either focus on giants or the one who can slay giants. It's rather simple. And thank God for our one-track mind, because it's so easy, as it were, to change the channel. I'm going to just trust the Lord. That is one of the greatest things that you can ever say. In spite of a difficult circumstance, say this, I'm just going to trust the Lord. That statement will change your life. I'm just going to trust the Lord. I don't have it figured out. I don't know what's going to come. I'm just going to trust the Lord. So that's the first part of the prescription. The second part of God's prescription for anxiety is prayer. Go back to Philippians 4:6 really quick. I'll give you a second. I'm not sure if you marked it. Philippians 4:6. This is the second part of the prescription. He says, Be anxious for nothing, but in everything by prayer and supplication with thanksgiving, let your requests be known to God. In verse 6, we see two ends of the spectrum. In verse 6, we see the word nothing and the word everything. Do you see that? Be anxious for nothing, but in everything by prayer and supplication. These two things are polar opposites of each other. And here's what is being communicated in this verse. Be anxious for nothing, but pray about everything. That too would be a good little bumper sticker. Be anxious for nothing, but pray about everything. Verse 6 also gives us a formula for prayer. Notice first that Paul informs us that we ought to begin our prayers how? With thanksgiving. With thanksgiving. In everything by prayer and supplication with thanksgiving, he says. You remember Psalm 100, it says, Enter his gates with what? Thanksgiving. And into his courts with praise. Be thankful unto him and bless his name. We also see this type of formula in the Lord's Prayer. You remember Jesus teaches us to say, Hallowed be thy name, long before he says, Give us this day our daily bread. Right? It's all about the formula. It's all about the process. He says, Our Father who is in heaven, hallowed be thy name. And then about midways through his formula prayer, he says, Then, in one sentence, ask of the things you might need. So Paul's point is clear in verse 6. Come unto God with a thankful heart. Bless his name. Worship him. Tell him how great he is. Count your many blessings. Name them one by one. And then does Paul say, let your request be made known to God. How oftentimes do we barge into heaven making demands of God? Making request of God instantaneously. Rather than coming unto God saying, God, you are great. You are wonderful. You're the greatest of all gods. You're the one and only true living. I mean, you see what I mean? Come into his courts with thanksgiving, and then let your request be made known to God. I put in my notes this. So only after you have poured yourself out do you ask the Lord to fill you back up. Pour yourself out to him. Lord, you are so great. And then, Lord, I need you to fill me back up. Bless the Lord first and then beseech him. Let me give you the definition for beseech. It means to ask for something urgently, fervently, and sincerely. You remember Jesus told a little story about a woman who came to the king one time and she asked the king of something, and he says, I'm more or less just going to blow her off. I'm not really going to consider her. But Jesus says the woman kept coming back and coming back and coming back. She was persistent. And the king said, okay, I'll do what she wants simply because she's rather annoying. Jesus says, you be like that too. Persistent prayers apparently work. Pray urgently, pray fervently, and pray sincerely. Will you go to the book of Hebrews really quick? Chapter 5, please. verse 7. This is a wonderful and incredible verse about Jesus that you might not have ever heard. 5:7. It says, who in the days of his flesh, when he had offered up prayers and supplication with vehement cries and tears to him who is able to save him from death, and was heard because of his godly fear. In other words, Jesus' prayers weren't puny. It says he offered up prayers with supplication with vehement cries and tears. And we see that in the Garden of Gethsemane, don't we? One of the Gospels, I can't remember which one, says that his sweat became like giant drops of blood. He was in anguish, and he was offering up prayers with vehement cries and tears. Can you imagine being a bystander hearing Jesus pray like that? It would be incredible. So now you have taken your God-given prescription. It's worship and it's prayer. And if you do that, the cure comes. Will you go back to Philippians 4:7, please? Let's see the cure. Let's see what happens. If I can find Philippians again. Here we go. That little book always hides from me. Verse 7. It says, and the peace of God, which surpasses all understanding, will guard your hearts and minds through Jesus Christ. Wow. The truth is this, hear me, the Christian does not have to live with anxiety. Why? Because God's prescription for anxiety always works. It always works. You say, where do you get that? Look at that word will. The peace of God, which surpasses all understanding, will guard your hearts and minds through Jesus Christ. So oftentimes I'll hear a drug commercial as I'm watching TV. It'll say something like this, 90% of patients experience noticeable results. But please call your doctor if you experience a heart attack, loss of eyesight, lack of energy, bad breath, swollen hands, a bad hair day, this, that, or the other. Aren't you glad that God's prescriptions have a 100% success rate? And that the effects are only ever wonderful? Paul says, look, if you come to God worshiping and giving thanks and lifting up needs, you will experience the peace of God. It will happen. It's always going to happen. 100% success rate. Come to God, worship Him, tell Him how great He is, barge into heaven, say, Father, hallowed be Thy name. That's how Jesus taught us to pray. In other words, Father, You're great. You are so wonderful. Worship Him, give thanks, and then say, Lord, now that I've done all those things, would You please do this for me? Lord, I do have a need. Lord, I am like a little child. And since You are my Father, since You are the greatest of all gods, since You sit on the throne of this universe, I need something from You. Never feel as though you cannot go to God asking for something. Oh, how many times I asked my earthly dad for stuff. Things I flat out didn't need, but I just wanted. I want ice cream. Never think that you cannot go to God asking for things. In fact, He desires that. Give us this day our daily bread, Jesus taught us to pray. One last thought on the peace of God. Paul says that the peace of God, quote, surpasses all understanding. In other words, this peace of God is so otherworldly that it's not even really going to make sense to you, and it's not even going to make sense to other people. That's the point of the phrase that passes all understanding. It's not going to make sense here on earth. Why? Because it's heavenly. Jesus didn't make sense to a lot of people because He was from heaven. He was the man from heaven. For example, Hebrews tells us that for the joy set before Him, Jesus endured the cross. Jesus, I tell you, is the only one who ever went to the cross to be crucified with joy. Right? Jesus had the peace of God which surpassed understanding. If you would have seen Jesus on His way to Golgotha, you would have said, why is there a smile on His face? Why does He look so determined? For the joy set before Him, He endured the cross. Jesus is the only one who's ever been crucified amongst the 30,000 that ever hung on the cross with joy in his heart. Why? Because he had the peace of God. He had heavenly peace, and he had already wrestled this out with the Father in Gethsemane, saying, look, 3 times, Father, if it be your will, let this cup of suffering pass from me. Nevertheless, not as I will, but as yours be done. And the moment he saw Judas Iscariot coming with the mob, Jesus knew it settled. I know I have to go to the cross. God answered my prayer by sending Judas here to arrest me. I'm Calvary bound, God is telling me clearly. And then for the joy set before him, he endured the cross. He had a heavenly peace. Consider also Paul and Silas. You remember they were beaten and put in prison. But they weren't cursing God. They were singing to God. They were singing hymns. Wouldn't you love to have a tape recording of that? Wow. I assure you that they were the only people in prison singing songs of thanksgiving to God, because they were, I would imagine, the only guiltless people in the whole prison. Their crime, as it were, was simply preaching the gospel. And they were beaten for doing just that. The peace of God is such that the believer can say, even though I walk through the valley of the shadow of death, I will fear no evil. Only a Christian can say that. Have you ever met a dying Christian? To meet a dying Christian is one of the greatest realities. They are some of the greatest people to meet, because you look at them, you know that they only have days left, maybe hours, and they have a joy about them that is just intoxicating. And yet they're the ones dying. Paul says it's going to surpass your human understanding. There's no good reason earthly why anyone should ever be joyous as they die. Heavenly speaking, we have all the reason to be joyous, though. For the joy set before me, I'll die. That's what Jesus said. I'm going to die for the glory of God. The peace of God is such that the believer can go through the darkest trial with a smile on their face and a thumbs up. I don't want to die tonight, and I do want to live a long life, but Lord, hear me. I want to live a long life, but I am ready to die. Aren't you ready to die and say, it is well with my soul. It is well with my soul. I have thought about my deathbed more times than you could even count. It's a weird obsession of mine, because I want to have the peace of God on my deathbed where people say, he's crazy. But a Christian in the room say, no, he's not. He's halfway to heaven, and he will soon see Jesus. Aren't you ready for that? I don't want to die tonight, and I want to live a long life, Lord. But I'm ready to die at some point, because I can't imagine being a testimony, even on our tombstones, what we write on our tombstone to say, it's still well with my soul. It's never been better with my soul. The tombstone is the only way to still speak after death, in my opinion. Unless you wrote books. I'll give you a story. Adrian Rogers, one of my favorite preachers, on his deathbed, his room was so crowded that his associate pastor, when he came to the hospital to see him, he was not able to, but there was a little window. And if I'm not mistaken, Adrian already had the thing that goes down your throat that helps you breathe. What's that called? A trach or something like that. But Adrian saw through his window his associate pastor sitting there or standing there looking in. And his associate writes later that Adrian just looked at him and did just like that. Thumbs up. Thumbs up. Let me give you another very personal example. My dad's mother, when she was on her deathbed, the whole family practically was around, and my dad said, you want us to pray with you? She said yes. She nodded her head at least, and my dad inhaled and was about to begin praying when all of a sudden she began praying. She was praying for us. She didn't pray for herself. Why pray for yourself? You're about to be in heaven in like 24 hours. She began praying for us, and we all thought, this is strange. It wasn't strange, but it's the upside-down kingdom in which we live if you're a part of Jesus' kingdom. The dead almost are the most joyous. Those suffering, those in the valley, they're the one giving the greatest witness and testimony for Jesus Christ. It's the upside-down kingdom in which we live. How was she able to do it? She had the peace of God which surpassed all understanding. What did not seem right to us in our mind, we thought, shouldn't we be praying for her? Wrong. She had peace like a river. She knew that she was going to be with Jesus and that we would be here on earth. And it does remind me of John 17 when Jesus is praying for his disciples. Jesus says, I pray not that you take them out of the world, but that you protect them from the evil one. To be alive is really the scary thing. To be alive on this world is to face all the attacks of our enemy. As you remember, he roams around like a roaring lion, seeking whom he may devour. I tell you the truth, if the Lord was not protecting us right now, Satan would cause this roof to cave in and kill us all. That's a promise. The hedge of protection God sets around his own children is utterly remarkable. If he were to lift it for one moment, you would be in your grave. To be alive is really the scary thing, but to go on to see Jesus, that's the great reality. I also want to say this. You will never be more filled with the Spirit than when you have gone to God in worship and in prayer and expressed your needs and throw yourself at his feet. You ought to try it. And if you say, I've been doing it for years, Coulter, okay, do it again tomorrow. Because you will come here Sunday with a glow about you. You'll be ready to explode. Go to God. Worship him. Say, hallowed be thy name. Express your needs and throw yourself at his feet. The last thing I want to say is God's medicine is the best medicine. I was listening to a sermon on the way here of another preacher who is going to be with the Lord in the past 6 months. He was talking about depression. And just like anxiety, depression is just so widespread. And he said, I understand that there does exist chemical imbalances within the brain. You can't deny that. But he says the vast majority of the things that we prescribe pills for in terms of depression, it is nothing more than just spiritual warfare. If you would fall at Jesus' feet and say, Lord, deliver me from this, he would deliver you. And so oftentimes, especially in the lost and dying world, those who do not have the Holy Spirit, what might look like depression could really be a demonic influence. And that pastor says, look, no pill can perform an exorcism. What you need is the grace of God in your life. The grace of God. And let me tell you this, the gospel is the only thing that changes lives. It is the only thing that brings real, actual life change. But here's God's prescription. Worship him and bring him thanksgiving. Bring him your needs. It's really quite simple. Aren't you glad you don't need a PhD in theology to understand this? So, along with this message, there's been a song on my heart all week long that I came across on Saturday that has just been wonderful to me over the past week, and I think it bleeds right in with this. So if you'll give me a second, I'll press play on the screen. I hope you